He was, I think, known for most of his life to be quite sort of difficult person, quite counter-suggestible, if not cantankerous in conversation. But when I met him, I have to say he was very pleasant. Like, he was at the end of coming last decade of his life, and he was very open to exchange. He seemed to me not to want people to agree with him. So he actually valued disagreement, and he was suspicious of people who were overly friendly and sort of complacent. So I picked up on that. And so I challenged him a lot, and he seemed to like that.
Hello and welcome to the New Orchard. A couple of years ago, I have purchased a book that was recommended to me by some algorithm on some bookselling website. I can't really remember where I got it from exactly, not that it really matters. The book arrived along with other 30 books and ended up on my shelf where it sat for almost 2 years, gathering dust amid my ever-growing pile of so-called must-reads. I think I'm a pretty slow reader. On a good day, I can get through 30, 40 pages. My appetite for reading is definitely bigger than my actual ability to get through the material. And so the dusty book towers in my little office room. Anyway, when I finally cracked it open earlier this year, the book felt like uncovering a kind of a map that eloquently explained why our modern world is so deeply polarized and fractured. Somehow, the material felt original, despite being very much based on the work by giants of philosophy like Aristotle and Aquinas. After Virtue, which is the title of the book I'm talking about here, was written by Alasdair MacIntyre back in 1981. MacIntyre was a Scottish-American philosopher. He was born in Glasgow in 1929 to a family of doctors. As a man, he was a restless thinker, partially because his parents instilled in him a sharp intellect and a deeply questioning spirit. He started as a Marxist in his youth, critiquing capitalism's alienating effects, but evolved through encounters with Wittgenstein, Aristotle, and then eventually Thomism, converting to Catholicism in the 1980s. By the 1970s, he saw modern moral philosophy in crisis. Debates reduced to emotive outbursts, lacking any form of shared foundation or even basic politeness. He decided to methodically diagnose the state of play, and that attempt resulted in After Virtue, where the author argued that the Enlightenment's quest for universal reason had shattered traditional ethics, leaving us with so-called emotivism, where good is essentially reduced to a personal preference, shouted the loudest. You might be wondering what emotivism sounds like. Well, have a quick listen to this.
It's not about the being and the cells. No, it's not about... No, I'm speaking. 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 Want to say one more time? No, I'm speaking. Got it. Thank you.
What you've just listened to was a clip from Jubilee's YouTube channel where the late Charlie Kirk was trying to get a word in a debate about the real value of modern universities. I could easily find thousands of exchanges like this simply because they are so incredibly common. Sadly, incredibly common. Anyway, let's get back to MacIntyre. Upon release, the book sparked a mild sensation in academic circles. Communitarians and conservatives loved it. Thinkers like Charles Taylor and Michael Sandel praised its revival of virtue ethics and the critique of individualism, seeing as a lifeline for community-based morality. Catholics and traditionalists hailed its nod to Aristotle and Aquinas. On the other hand, liberals and modernists hated it, calling it deeply pessimistic, nostalgic, and even anti-progressive, for dismissing Enlightenment's heroes like Kant and Nietzsche as a part of the problem. MacIntyre himself, in later editions and sequels like Whose Justice, Which Rationality, stood firm. In 2007 Postscript to After Virtue's third edition, he addressed critics by refining his ideas even further, emphasizing that his disquieting suggestion of a new dark age wasn't defeatist, but a call to action. That disquieting suggestion meant that we're essentially living in the ruins of a once coherent moral tradition, much like the post-Roman barbarians, totally unaware of their loss. In After Virtue, MacIntyre revives virtue ethics, focusing on character traits like justice, courage, and honesty, which are meant to be cultivated through social practices over rule-based systems. He argues that true morality emerges from narratives and traditions, not abstract principles, providing a framework for meaningful lives amid relativism. MacIntyre warns that Western society is like post-Roman Europe, civilized in appearance but morally bankrupt, heading towards barbarism without intervention. The book claims that the West needs virtue ethics to survive because Enlightenment individualism has eroded communal bonds, leading to managerial manipulation and emotivist chaos. And you can see everywhere how this sentiment has captured both politics and corporations. The author is pretty clear that there are no easy fixes, but to avert total collapse, we must foster new forms of community akin to monastic orders. We need small virtue-centered groups preserving traditions against ever-growing tide of bureaucratic decay. Without this, the West is at risk of total fragmentation. MacIntyre's central claim is that it is virtues that are the glue for sustainable societies and that both capitalism's exploitation and socialism's statism has to be ultimately rejected. I think in 2025 and beyond, MacIntyre's warnings, his wisdom, his suggestions couldn't be more relevant, with social media absolutely deranging all of its users by amplifying emotive echo chambers and global polarization turning every issue into a massive shouting match. MacIntyre's insight explain why we can't agree on basic things like justice and truth. As we navigate post-truth politics and cultural fragmentation, his call for narrative-driven virtues offers a kind of a roadmap to rebuild trust and character in an increasingly divided world, and this is why I strongly believe in deep relevance of his work today. I finished reading After Virtue just as the news broke of MacIntyre's death on May 21st, 2025. He died at the age of 96, and may his good soul rest in peace. Naturally, what I would normally do is reach out to the author and ask him if he would be willing to spend a bit of time with me and answer a few questions that popped into my head while I was reading his book. But that was simply not meant to be. But as I've just said a moment ago, I think After Virtue is extremely relevant as a key to understanding why we are increasingly unable to gently navigate the hyper-complexity of the modern world. And I felt that I must somehow help deliver its message for my small but growing audience. And this is the reason why I've decided to look for someone who knows and understands MacIntyre's work and is willing to answer my questions about the book. After a bit of search, I'm pleased to tell you I have found just the right person for the job, someone who can present MacIntyre's work with depth and clarity. My guest today is Tom Angier, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cape Town. Tom's research interests lie in Aristotelian and Neo-Aristotelian ethical and political theory. His most recent monograph is on natural law theory, which is accompanied by 2 edited collections, the Cambridge Companion to Natural Law Ethics and the Cambridge Handbook to Natural Law and Human Rights. In February 2026, he will publish another, much fuller monograph titled Human Nature, Human Goods, A Theory of Natural Perfectionism. It is my privilege to have Tom on the show today, as he will help illuminate the profound insights contained in MacIntyre's After Virtue. Let's dive in. All right, let's start with this. What is the central problem MacIntyre identifies in After Virtue about how we talk about morality today? And how does his opening metaphor of post-catastrophe world illustrate it?
Well, I think that the central problem MacIntyre identifies in the book is one of incoherence and fragmentation. So the basic idea is that we inherit different conceptual and argumentative schemes from the past, and then we totalize them in a sense, and we forget, we don't understand their interrelation or their significance when they're taken on their own. And MacIntyre compares this to a civilizational catastrophe where we lose scientific knowledge and try to piece it together from fragments which have been left over. He actually borrowed that metaphor from a novel called A Canticle for Leibowitz, which was an apocalyptic novel about monastic survival in the Dark Ages. So he's drawing on literature, if you like, to make a philosophical point. There's also something I could say there about the end of the book, because at the end of the book, he invokes the idea of Saint Benedict and a new Saint Benedict being our best hope. But we can come back to that.
MacIntyre says that we are living in a moral dark age because of emotivism. Do you mind explaining to us what emotivism is and give us an example of how it shows up in everyday life?
Well, emotivism could be considered one of the moral shards left over from our moral inheritance, if you like. That moral shard has been totalized and reconfigured into a moral theory. The core claim of that theory is that moral claims are reducible to expressions of emotion or feeling, what's become known as a pro-attitude or a con-attitude. And this shows up in everyday life in the assumption that moral disputes are not really disagreements, which are resolvable by reason. Rather, they're differences in emotional disposition akin to different tastes. For example, we don't disagree about what ice cream flavors are good. We just have different tastes. Now, that might capture perhaps different pragmatic aspects of moral language. For instance, if I say, that's an excellent job, right, or excellent job, that expresses an emotion, but it doesn't seem to capture fundamental moral controversies very well. It certainly doesn't make them rationally resolvable.
Why do you think MacIntyre thought that Enlightenment's attempt to ground morality in reason alone has failed? And what did we lose when we abandoned Aristotle's approach?
Well, I actually think that MacIntyre misexpresses himself here. I don't think he means that morality can't be grounded in reason. I think he means it can't be grounded in an impoverished 18th century conception of reason. It can be grounded, however, in a richer Aristotelian conception of reason, namely what Aristotle calls practical reason. And the reason, pardon the pun, is that practical reason understands reason as engaging our fundamental desires, particularly our fundamental desire for the good, a good which consists in the fulfillment or completion of our nature. So the basic response is that it's not that the Enlightenment engagement with reason per se is bad. It's the type of reason or the conception of reason that's at play, which is the problem. So it's a return, if you like, to an Aristotelian, richer conception of practical reason which engages the desires. Now, whether we acknowledge it or not, Aristotle thought that we have an ultimate end, or what he calls a telos, which none of us can avoid having. And he calls that eudaimonia, or fulfillment or flourishing. So we all have that deep desire to flourish or to be fulfilled. And practical reason is there to get us there, if you like, or to discern how we get to eudaimonia.
Well, that's really interesting because MacIntyre revives Aristotle's idea of virtues. Do you mind explaining what he means by virtues and how they differ from sort of modern ideas of morality?
Right, so Aristotelian virtues, in a nutshell, are character traits which amount to excellences of character. They are developed by repeated action, mainly action towards others. For instance, in just action, the virtue of justice is employed and it's an other-regarding virtue. But there's also virtuous action which is towards oneself. For instance, temperance. The virtue of temperance is the control of one's appetites. And that differs from modern moral ideas because it focuses on character rather than action as such, although, of course, action does develop character. It also differs from modern ideas of morality because it doesn't reduce morality to other regarding action. Modern theories of ethics tend to think of the ethical, the moral, as vis-a-vis other people only. There's a further tension with modernity insofar as MacIntyre reserves a key role for fulfillment or eudaimonia. And he doesn't, Aristotle as well, of course, doesn't view that with suspicion, as in Kant or the utilitarians. So the idea that we should be aiming at our own fulfillment is not a problem, although it is for the moderns. Now, Kant and the utilitarians, they're both 18th century moral doctrines, and they also focus on rules of action. So unlike Aristotle, they're focusing on rules and action as primary, whereas for Aristotle, it's virtues that are primary, and action takes a kind of backseat or subsidiary role. I could say more. I think that, in a sense, what the modern philosophers do is reduce virtue to a means. They say that virtue is really just a means to maximizing our compliance with various rules. So virtue ceases for Kant and the utilitarians to have a value per se. It's just really an instrument to achieve something else.
I'm interested to find out from you, what are practices in after virtue, and why does MacIntyre think they are essential for cultivating virtues? Can you give us an example of a practice we might recognize today?
Yeah, so it's a difficult question because although practice forms a central plank of his theory, it's not easy to pin down exactly what it means. I would say that for MacIntyre, practice is a quasi-technical term. It picks out forms of activity which embody and develop virtues of character. For instance, chess, which develops various intellectual and social virtues, or fishing, painting, playing an instrument. Now, a complication here is that MacIntyre distinguishes practices from skills, but in fact, most of his examples of practices look like they are skills or quasi-skills. In a later book called Three Rival Versions of Moral Inquiry, he spends some time on traditions of skilled activity, and he shows how they require people to be inducted into various practices. So practices, if you like, are schools of virtue, and they're mediated by our particular culture and the institutions of our particular form of social life.
MacIntyre talks about the narrative unity of life. What does this mean, and how does it help us understand what it means to live a good life?
The idea of a narrative unity to life is difficult to elaborate. I think that it seems to rest on a psychological thesis that we're storytelling animals whose form of life shows a basic need for unity or coherence over time. That is, we need to be able to conjoin the episodes of our life into a coherent whole. And insofar as we can't do that, our lives become disintegrated, or what MacIntyre later calls compartmentalized. So that kind of disintegration can at worst lead to pathology or mental illness. at best, it involves a kind of dissociation, I think, between different aspects of our life, like our work life, our personal life, our spiritual life, and these all sort of come apart in some way. I think the main way they can come apart for him is that they take on different and competing moral standards. So different aspects of our life are governed by different moral codes, if you like. And that is detrimental because it's one person, it's us, who's living the whole life. So we suffer from a kind of internal discontinuity, and we feel the need to overcome it. If we don't do that, then fulfillment, eudaimonia, will be beyond our reach. So I think there's both a psychological aspect to narrative unity, and there's also a moral aspect.
How does MacIntyre's emphasis on community challenge modern individualism? And why does he think we need communities to be moral?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one thing about community as a term is that it became very popular in the 1990s. It gave rise to a philosophical movement called communitarianism. And it saw itself as resisting a type of position, sometimes called liberal individualism, primarily among political philosophers. So communitarians thought of themselves as resisting a dominant approach to political philosophy. It's both individualistic and liberal. Now, MacIntyre actually denied that he was a communitarian. And I think he was worried by what he perceived as certain, you might call conservative tendencies within the movement. But what's clear, I think, is that he does think the self is fundamentally a social artifact. That is, it can't be developed apart from a particular social order. And in his later book called Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity, he privileges local forms of community, and he thinks that they are the best ways of developing our character. And he seems to depreciate, therefore, large-scale nation-states. He thinks that a large-scale nation-state can't really be a community at all. So, in sum, there's a sense in which we're inducted into the virtues, into good character through social means, and those social means have to be relatively locally structured. Otherwise, we can't develop the virtues. That seems to be the view. Now, I think, just to finish up, there is a problem here because I've switched between two terms, that is social and communal, and they're clearly not synonyms. So MacIntyre, I think, doesn't do enough to define exactly what form of social belonging he favours, or exactly how community should be defined. But what is clear is that he's in favour of, as it were, induction into social life at a relatively local level, and he's rather hostile to the large-scale nation-states.
What do you think his definition of a large nation-state would be?
Yeah, well, I mean, he lived most of his adult life in the United States, which is a vast scale nation state, much bigger than the one he grew up in. Now it's over 350 million. So I think that was part of the motivation here, that he felt there was an unwieldiness to the United States as a form of social order. It didn't allow a kind of development of human excellences because it was too, it was too internally divided and diverse to permit that.
MacIntyre critiques modern institutions like bureaucracies and capitalism. What's wrong with them from his perspective, would you say? And what kind of communities does he propose instead specifically?
Yeah, so interestingly, the younger MacIntyre was very involved in Marxism in the UK. And that only came to an end, really, when he moved to the States in the early 70s. So that interest in Marxism comes back in a major way in his last book, Ethics and the Conflicts of Modernity. And there he shows a kind of hostility towards large-scale bureaucracies and economies. And he rests, as it were, that hostility primarily on its distance from ordinary life and its locally inflected needs. So I would say that you could respond to your question by saying he affirms a principle of subsidiarity, as it's called. That principle says that social functions should be exercised locally wherever that can be done efficiently and competently. So hence MacIntyre's kind of attracted to things like Irish and Danish fishing communities because they have a kind of autonomy over their social life, which he thinks is proper. He has met with criticism, of course, on this. He's accused of nostalgia. He's accused of naivety because people say that most modern people in Western states desire to live in cities, and the economies of scale afforded by large-scale nation-states means that they can have access to lots more products and goods than they would otherwise. So in some ways, I think that MacIntyre is sort of treading a sort of rather difficult road here. He's quite close in some ways to the Southern agrarians, as they're called in the United States, people like Wendell Berry. They picture life at its best when it's lived close to the locality and close to the land, in fact. And I think that doesn't really have much to offer to most people living in contemporary Western states because they tend not to live on the land, and they tend to want all the goods of the contemporary marketplace.
Why does MacIntyre look to Aristotle and medieval traditions like Aquinas for inspiration? What can we learn from these older frameworks today?
So one key reason he looks back, if you like, to the ancient and medieval heritage in philosophy is that he thinks that they hadn't yet given up on a key idea, and that idea was natural teleology. What does that mean? Well, it's basically the view that humans are ordered to certain forms of fulfillment which are objective. So individuals don't devise those forms, but they're conditioned by them and they're obliged to act in accordance with them. So that idea is very powerful in MacIntyre. He wants to preserve it. Now, of course, that idea of natural teleology is deeply in tension with two modern ideas. The first is the tendency towards liberal individualism in political philosophy, and also its in tension, arguably, with Darwinian ideas. The idea, among certain Darwinists at least, that natural teleology is just defunct and it can't be resurrected. So MacIntyre resists talking about natural teleology in After Virtue, at least. He talks about social teleology instead. And I think that's partly because he doesn't want to encounter the pushback among evolutionary biologists. And he reiterates the socially conditioned nature of all human fulfillment. he also pushes back against the liberal individualists, for instance, the existentialists, like he thinks Kierkegaard was, and Nietzsche, who he thinks pervade a kind of individualist fantasy through his idea of the overman, the Übermensch. So, in a nutshell, that people like Aristotle and Aquinas stand for MacIntyre as bullocks against modern mistakes, such as existentialism and Nietzscheanism.
How does After Virtue redefine justice as a virtue rather than a set of rules or outcomes, and why does this matter?
So Aristotle defines justice primarily as a disposition, that is, as a virtue, and it's the disposition to give other people their due. Now, by contrast, modern philosophers like Kant and Bentham think of justice as conformity to rules of distribution. So that introduces a strongly procedural element into justice, which reaches its high watermark in philosophers like John Rawls, who elaborates a contract theory of justice. So in some ways, I think these contrasts are overdrawn, since Aristotle does draw up certain rules of justice, for instance, rules of rectification, rules of distribution. And he thinks that the virtue of justice is meant to honour and aim at those rules, or at least incorporate them into practice. So he wants to, on the one hand, highlight virtue as a prism for all moral and political life. And justice comes in as an instance of that. So justice is treated no differently in that respect. It's just another, albeit very important, virtue. Where it differs from the other virtues, according to Aristotle, is that it's purely other-regarding. There's no justice that is towards the self for Aristotle. We can't be just towards ourselves. We're only just towards others. So yeah, in sum, there are rules of justice, but they're not, as it were, highlighted by Aristotle insofar as justice per se is a virtue of character.
All right, let's talk about tradition. What role does tradition play in After Virtue, and how does MacIntyre balance respecting tradition with the need for critical reflection?
I talked earlier about craft traditions, and those encompass, as it were, traditions of practice. Now, it's true that tradition has a wider significance for MacIntyre than craft tradition. He thinks that all thought is, in a way, traditioned. What does that mean? Well, for instance, there are traditions of philosophy, and MacIntyre's own philosophical reflection proceeds through the Western tradition almost exclusively. And he's perfectly, as it were, aware of that, and he affirms that. The trouble is that it's led to certain worries. On the one hand, there's a worry about what you might call conservatism. On the other hand, there's a worry about relativism. Now, what's the worry about relativism? It's the worry that there's no truth which is not embodied within a particular tradition. So the question then would be, why should I accept the authorities that govern this particular tradition? And that's a worry about conservatism. So we're all bound to traditions, but the traditions involve authority, and why should I accept that authority? Now, MacIntyre is aware of those problems, and he gives a highly complex set of answers to them. In brief, he draws on the philosophy of Hegel to answer them. So he says, it's true that traditions are not, as it were, perfect artifacts, so they're subject to challenge. When a particular tradition throws up real contradictions within itself, then if the tradition cannot resolve that contradiction, it has to turn to other traditions to resolve it. And in that kind of case, a tradition could at worst be defeated. At least it has to defer to another tradition. And he gives various examples of this, the way that, for instance, Newtonian physics was partly defeated by Einsteinian quantum mechanics. And he thinks the similar things can happen within philosophy. So, for instance, he thinks that Augustinian Christianity was defeated in some ways by Aristotelianism. So it's a bit difficult to summarize because there's a lot of Baroque features to this account. But I think at least you can say that MacIntyre is aware of the problems that tradition throws up, and he tries at least to address them.
What's one passage or idea from After Virtue that struck you personally, and how did you make sense of the book's dense style when you first read it?
Well, on the passage or idea, I was personally struck by MacIntyre's advocacy of natural teleology. As I've already mentioned, the idea that people have, as it were, an intrinsic orderedness to a certain form of fulfillment. That idea was very brave and fresh in the 1980s, even though it was a resurrection of older ideas. But nobody was saying that kind of thing back then. And so I was struck by that, and that has been key to my own work in many ways. I've written in support of that idea and written a whole book about it recently. Now, I think that why it's important is that in the context of After Virtue, he uses that idea to show how we can't rely merely on ad hoc desires or a very thin conception of reason. Neither of those will be sufficient foundations for ethics. You really have to return, he argues, to an Aristotelian natural teleology of the human person in order to make ethics viable. Now, your second question was about style, and I thought it was odd that you called it dense. I think that style is actually very accessible. He writes clearly. In my view, he writes clearly. I think where it is dense is the number of historical references are very many. And so there's a kind of density of historical material, which I think many people find a bit difficult to get to grips with. But compared to many philosophers, at least, so, relative to his peers, he is actually a very clear writer in general. Yeah. But you clearly haven't had the misfortune to read it.
No, I love it. I love it. That is a commentary on my ability to read philosophy, I think, more than anything.
Sure.
All right, let's switch gears a little bit and connect what MacIntyre wrote in After Virtue to current state of the world in 2025. MacIntyre's critique of emotivism seems to describe today's polarized debates like the ones we see on X and other social media platforms about politics or culture. How does After Virtue explain why we're so divided over moral issues in 2025?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that you're right that social media debates often descend into a kind of emotionally overheated slanging match. And there doesn't seem any possibility of rational adjudication between people's claims, points of view. I think parties to those debates seem to share very few premises, and they appear, moreover, uninterested in discovering even what those premises are. So, in a sense, After Virtue was quite prophetic, even if at the time it appeared rather uncharitable and exaggerated. I think it's sort of come true, if you like. I think what just more broadly social media enables is a kind of amplification of private grumbling. So what before the internet would have been private grumbles are now public shouting matches. So it's not as if things have changed a lot. It's just that there's a new technology which has enabled that funneling up to the public sphere. And that's, I think, made louder and more unwieldy by the very irresponsible nature of the medium, because it encourages immediate, intemperate responses to people, instead of calm reflection and a kind of humility to hold back. Particularly since you can often post anonymously and you don't therefore have to take responsibility for what you say. There's a lack of accountability built into the medium. So I think that the division, in a sense, was probably always there. It's just been amplified and made more visible, and in some ways perhaps exacerbated by the technology.
In After Virtue, and you briefly talked about this already today, in After Virtue, MacIntyre warns about the decline of community. How do you see this playing out today with things like social isolation or even the erosion of local institutions?
Yeah, I think, again, I'm not quite sure of the precise meaning of community in MacIntyre's work. But the internet has at least created the sense that we can inhabit social networks, very broad networks, even globally. But the kind of communication it affords doesn't really amount to much if we never meet our interlocutors in person. So real human institutions, I think, require meeting people more than virtually. If they don't allow that, then the meeting, the pseudo meeting, if you like, is unsatisfying, it's partial, it's superficial. And most online interaction, I think, is like that. Again, I think that reflects our nature, something I think that MacIntyre would agree with, that we're embodied social animals. So we need a fuller set of cues when we interact with each other, bodily nuance, gestures, tone, these things are only fully conveyed face to face. And I think that therefore a lot of online interaction is very minimal, it's unsatisfying, it leaves a kind of hollow feeling. We're kind of depleted beings online. There's also a second aspect to that, going back to Wendell Berry, that of course online we're wholly isolated from the world of other animals and plants. So there's a kind of hankering, I think, among many people for genuine activity. Something even as simple as fishing, right, which MacIntyre talks about a lot, right? The local relations you have between people, that those kind of genuine embodied relations tend to leave far more impression on people and to shape them far more deeply than anything they do on the screen.
Patriotism is obviously a very hot topic today. It's being questioned by a lot of people who label it as sort of toxic emotion, a fossilized remnant of violent history that led to 2 world wars. How do you think MacIntyre's ideas presented in After Virtue help us rethink what it means to love our country?
Yeah, so patriotism is a value, it seems, for MacIntyre. He wrote a whole paper on it, and he engages with our relation to wider social orders. Now, that said, he does have this Marxist background, and that made him alive, I think, to the injustice that can arise through nationalism in particular, especially when it becomes belligerent against other nations. So, although I think MacIntyre's political theory is somewhat undeveloped, I think he's in favour of giving a kind of priority to one's own community and wider nation state. so long as that doesn't entail gross injustice towards people outside the nation state. So my guess is that he's a kind of moderate cosmopolitan, as it's called. And in that paper on patriotism from, I think, 1984, he praises the resistors, the active resistors to the National Socialist regime in Germany. And he says that the people who resisted that regime were more loyal to Germany than those who went along with it, because one can be loyal to a nation in the sense of a moral conception of the nation. It's not a, as it were, patriotism of my country right or wrong. Then again, I should stress again that he does show suspicion of large-scale nation states. So there's a sense in which he may not be sympathetic to a state the size of the United States being the object of any loyalty. It's just too unwieldy, it's too unaccountable, if you like, to warrant that. But I'm kind of guessing there because he didn't really write enough to make a clear response possible.
All right, thank you for that caveat, Tom. How can after virtue idea of practices, which you've talked about this a little bit earlier in the interview, but how can those ideas of practices inspire solutions to modern problems like rebuilding trust in communities or addressing crazy cultural fragmentation at the moment?
So to go back to the idea of practice, I think that highlights how social activities are often mediated by craft or skill traditions. So it's very important that those be kept alive if we want a quality of life, good quality of life in the future. So an example of that might be the German-speaking countries which have retained a strong set of craft traditions. They've retained them while also investing in adapting them to modern production and distribution practices. So they seem to have much better than the Anglophone norm retained a respect for the past, but adapted it to new conditions. And I think it's a country like the United Kingdom didn't do that because it was industrialized very early and it just lost many of its craft traditions. So as to trust, cultural fragmentation, that is, as it were, prevented to some degree by the preservation of these traditions. I think the Anglophone world which we inhabit is to some degree at a disadvantage here because it speaks the world language. So it's much more open to global fashion, particularly global fashions that emerge from the United States. So although that has many benefits, if you live in Melbourne, you'll know all the different foods and musical traditions that you have access to. So it allows a great variety and richness of practice. It's not that good at sustaining those practices over time because practices can only survive if they're, as it were, if we understand what enables their survival, and that means being inducted into those particular practices. So I think that there's a sense in which the Anglophone world, in the context of the Western world, is constantly at risk of losing craft knowledge in a way in which more linguistically local cultures aren't.
MacIntyre critiques modern institutions, seems to specifically dislike bloated bureaucracies. How do you see this critique applying to today's institutions like big tech or government in 2025?
So I was quite struck with this question because it occurred to me that a strong Marxist theme is the way that technology drives social and economic change. Right? And I think that that's particularly apparent with the influence of the internet. And it's now even more apparent perhaps in the case of so-called artificial intelligence. That's going to have wide effects on institutions, not least universities. MacIntyre's actually not as vocal as he might be about the role of technology. He doesn't really talk much about how technology can just destroy whole institutions, forms of life, and how it can create others. As to the future, in light of these changes, I think the predictions are very difficult to make. Personally, I doubt whether the predictions of mass unemployment are, owing to artificial intelligence, are more than scaremongering. But I might be wrong about that. What seems clear is that our nature, again, is to be productive beings, right? Human beings are essentially productive beings. We're only really functional when we're doing and making things. So if we're too passive or unoccupied, we don't do well as a species. And I think that is a worry, that if artificial intelligence takes over lots of jobs, then we'll be rendered incapacitated because we just won't be doing enough. And I think that won't lead to fulfillment. It will lead to a kind of dystopia.
Given the mental health crisis and deep sense of purposelessness many people feel today, how can MacIntyre's narrative unity of life offer hope or any form of guidance at all?
Here I'm actually quite skeptical. So there's a great paper on narrative unity by somebody I know called Micah Lott. It's in that collection on After Virtue. And Micah argues that unity takes many forms and hence doesn't set clear constraints on human action or activity. To say that a life should be narratively unified. People certainly need goals of action, and without those goals, they lapse into a kind of anomie, sort of form of aimlessness, despair. So I think what's clear here is that we do need meaningful goals to achieve. I think without those, there's a kind of hopelessness that sets in. Bringing up families traditionally has played that role for many people, sets them a task, sets them clear, as it were, boundaries, etc. But I think the trouble is, in the West at least, that parental authority has been undermined by many different forces, and parents increasingly doubt their own ability to set clear boundaries and direct their children at all. So I think that source of meaningful achievement is under threat. It may be that there will be a kind of set of religious revivals, because religious cultures tend to help in those respects. They tend to set clear goals, clear roles, clear boundaries, and a clear set of virtues. But the trouble is that in the West, at least, the opinion forming class, the intelligentsia, if you like, is almost completely irreligious. So that there's a kind of hostility built into the intelligentsia towards that. And I think that leads to a massive tension between religious cultures and the upper middle classes. And I think that there's no clear way through there. I think there's just going to be a series of conflicts over that.
Yeah, it would be hard to disagree with that last statement. MacIntyre calls for new kinds of communities to sustain virtues. What example of such communities do you see emerging in 2025 and beyond? And how do you think they reflect his vision, if they reflect his vision at all?
Yeah, so it's back to this vexed notion of community. I think if you look back at for instance, the hippie communes of the 60s or the Israeli kibbutzim movement, they collapsed basically because they lacked what we were just talking about: clear roles for people, clear duties, clear responsibilities, and conceptions of the virtues. So those kind of communities were unsustainable. They were just too amorphous, if you like. Now, it seems to me that a religion like Islam is growing mainly because it offers clear answers on those fronts, even if there's lots of different types of Islam. So I think my hunch would be in the medium term, those kind of communities are going to grow, ones that offer those kind of relatively clear structures, goals to people. Now, MacIntyre's own solution, if he has one, to these problems is mooted at the end of the book, and he talks about Benedictine communities in medieval Europe. And he says we're looking for a new, doubtless very different St. Benedict, words to that effect. Well, it's an interesting invocation. I'm not sure exactly how we should take it. Many people have speculated about it. One of the clear problems with it is that Benedictine communities are made up of chaste celibates, right? So they're unmarried men, and so they don't reproduce themselves in any direct way. And they don't, in the modern world, offer, I think, a viable model, therefore. Not that there's no room for them, but they're just going to be a peripheral social model. Maybe what's going to happen is that when technology develops, there will be a kind of colonization of different planets. And new social groups, movements will colonize different individual planets. But that's very speculative, and I think that my moral imagination is not competent to talk about that. What would happen?
All right, final question. If MacIntyre were alive today, what's one piece of advice he might give us to navigate the moral and cultural challenges of 2025 based on how he wrote After Virtue? I know it might be tricky to answer that question, but just give it your best shot.
So I think building on what we've talked about in the way of practices and traditions and human nature, I'd say that one of the key messages from the book is to respect the past in order to build a viable future. So you can't conjure up a human or humane future from scratch. You have to draw on traditions of thought, renew them, adapt them. They're not unchanging, so there's not the worry of sort of an unreasoning conservatism, but you do have to draw on the past, whatever you do in the future. And I think that emphasis on tradition is fruitful. And it's what I think working in a university as I do, I can see is under threat. The other thing I'd say is remember that there's such a thing as human nature. So I've worked on this recently as well. The idea that you can have a kind of infinitely creative approach to the human person. If this has been very much at the forefront of the transhumanist movement, the idea that we can create, in some sense, a new species, and that will be, as it were, for the better. Well, I think that idea is actually incoherent, because in order to know if something's better, you have to have a set of standards or criteria for what makes them better. But when you abandon the idea of a nature, in our case, a human nature, you lose a grip on what those standards are, and you just sort of go over to a wholly unconstrained mode of experimentation. There's no, as it were, normative criteria there for what would be better or worse. You just enter the realm of fantasy and stipulation, if you like. So I think that that's a key message from the book as well. If you want to preserve a viable ethical vision, you need some analysis of human nature.
Tom, thank you very much for illuminating central themes of MacIntyre's After Virtue for us today. This was fantastic, and I really appreciate the effort and your time.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
Absolute pleasure, Tom. Alasdair MacIntyre's After Virtue is essential reading for anyone interested in contributing to preservation and ongoing thriving of the West, because it exposes fragmentation and inevitable decaying of modern ethics. Without shared telos, moral discourse becomes endless conflict, as seen today in polarised debates about cultural and political issues. MacIntyre tells us that we are barbarians in suits, civilised on the surface, but morally adrift, with institutions manipulating us through bureaucratic management. Without rebuilding small, virtue-centred communities like modern St. Benedict's preserving traditions, we risk total collapse amid relativism and different power struggles. MacIntyre was also very clear that After Virtue offered no easy or quick fixes. We all, at individual level, have to aspire to do better and lead by example, gradually, brick by brick, rebuilding the essence of what has been lost. I want to say a big thank you to Tom Angier, our guest today. I hope you found his points of view in relation to After Virtue as illuminating as I have. Make sure you check out Tom's The Cambridge Companion to Natural Law Ethics, the Cambridge Handbook to Natural Law and Human Rights, and soon to be released, Human Nature, Human Goods, A Theory of Natural Perfectionism, which will be published in February 2026. As always, you can find all the relevant links in the show notes. The cover artwork I've picked for this episode is Raphael's Vision of a Knight. This is an early Renaissance painting that symbolises a young knight choosing between virtue, as represented by a woman offering a book and a sword, and vice. I see it as a direct allegory of ethical decision-making, echoing MacIntyre's emphasis on narrative quest for the good life. If you have enjoyed this episode, please kindly give us a good review. Thank you for your attention today, and hoping to see you next time.